Written on the clock tower memorial of 22 Special Air Service Regiment in Hereford is an extract from the verse play Hassan, written at the turn of the 19th century by James Elroy Flecker and adopted by the regiment. But who are ye in rags and rotten shoes, you dirty bearded blocking the way? We are the pilgrims, O master. We shall go always a little further. It may be beyond that last blue mountain barred with snow, across that angry or that glimmering sea. This poem epitomizes the philosophy of the SAS, which is arguably Britain's most secret military unit. It operates in faraway places under difficult and dangerous circumstances, requiring great personal initiative and determination on the part of individual troopers, to resolve problems and defeat obstacles, often at a moment's notice, expecting the unexpected. Modern warfare is a relentless exercise in killing. Since the Second World War, there have been hundreds of conflicts. Some have been clandestine affairs, fought in remote jungles. Others have destroyed the lives of millions, grotesquely played out for a horrified world. Throughout them all, there have been men in special units who fought for more than king and country. They are soldiers who take grim pride in beating the odds. These are the men who brag the least, who fear death, but who are willing to confront their darkest misgivings. Their goal is not just victory over the enemy. Every man seeks to overcome the inherent frailties of body and soul. For them, success in war is often measured by meeting deeply personal standards of conduct. Frequently rebels, who resent the bureaucracy of large armies and reject unnecessary discipline. But in troubled times, nations anxiously turn to them. In Britain, it has been the SAS and SBS. The Americans have turned to its Army Green Beret, Marine Corps, and the secret Delta Force. France has its famed Foreign Legion. All share the common expectation of demanding the most of their recruits. The origins of the modern British elite forces are found in the bitter lessons learnt in action against her enemies. In the South African wars at the turn of the last century, Dutch farmers formed small but highly mobile strike teams called commando. These units played havoc with British forces. Although the Boers were generally despised for their unconventional techniques, certain officers learned from the tactics used by the fast-moving farmers on horseback. A few years later, in World War I, the slaughter of trench warfare horrified both the Allies and Germans. Neither side seemed capable of breaking the stalemate trench warfare. In a desperate bid to break the deadlock in 1918, the Germans organised small, specially trained teams to infiltrate Allied lines. They were called Stoßtruppen, or shock troops. Their fast-paced tactics stunned the Allies. Germany was too weak to continue the war, but some in the British Army would remember these lightning-quick strikes. Armistice brought to an end the battlefield carnage. Britain demobilised rapidly. She wanted to restore her shattered economy and heal the wounds of a generation. The Germans also sought to rebuild, but for a different reason. They wanted vengeance. The British ignored the dangers posed by the resurgence of German military might and the rise of Hitler. The German invasion of Poland dashed Europe's hopes of a future without general war. Britain had only just begun to rearm, and a research office was established charged with developing innovative tactics. They would need new ideas. In October 1939, the Nazi conquest of Poland was complete. The Allies waited for the Germans' next move. The French were relying on their Maginot Line to keep the Germans from pouring west across the border. The British used the Royal Navy to begin a blockade of German ports. Churchill was brought into the War Cabinet as head of the Admiralty and immediately began plotting ways to strike back at the Germans. But the standing British army was small. The RAF was just beginning to build up with new planes, but there were few trained pilots. In April 1940, the Germans struck into Norway. The British and French tried in vain to halt their advance. The Germans outmaneuvered them on the battlefield. They were forced to withdraw. Real change finally came to the British Army after the May Blitzkrieg along the Western Front. The Germans simply sidestepped the Allied forces and pushed them into the sea. Dunkirk was a vision of both despair and hope, and the British Army was evacuated. Churchill became Prime Minister and offered brave words to the British public, but privately realised it would take a miracle to save Britain. The fall of France finally galvanised the reformers in the army. Recalling the deadly effectiveness of the Boers in the South African War and the shock troops used by the Germans in 1918, they urged creation of a new force of highly trained mobile light infantry. Churchill was impressed, and he was desperate. A new 5,000-man unit was created and became known as the Commandos. They would be used for strikes against the Germans in occupied Europe. They captured the public's imagination. The use of special troops at this point would not win the war, but did help keep morale up during the dark days of the Blitz. Throughout 1940, the British remained on the defensive. The Commandos kept harassing the Germans in occupied France and Norway, but this was still a conventional war. And a decisive battle would be fought 1,000 miles away in North Africa. It would be a fight that the British had to win. In February 1941, General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was dispatched to lead the Axis armies of the Afrika Korps. Considered one of the war's most brilliant tacticians, he increased pressure on the British. Battles were fought savagely over hundreds of miles of otherwise empty desert. This shoving match of armies resulted in no clear victory for either side. A Rommel offensive in early 1942 appeared to give the Germans the edge. By May, they were pushing the British back across a wide front. Victory seemed within grasp. In June, the long-suffering outpost of Tobruk fell to the Afrika Korps. Rommel hurled the British further back towards Cairo. His army reached El Alamein, some 60 miles from the port of Alexandria. If it fell, the whole Middle East, with its rich oil fields, would be in Axis hands. In August, Lieutenant General Montgomery took control of the beleaguered 8th Army and immediately planned a daring counterattack. A young officer serving in the Scots Guards sensed opportunity was at hand. In 1941, David Stirling devised a plan to send small numbers of elite troops on deep penetration raids behind German lines. He was finally given the go-ahead for his radical proposal, and the Special Air Services Brigade was formed. Throughout the fall of 1942, in preparation for the upcoming battle, Monty used the SAS effectively to disrupt enemy supply lines and blow up their munition stockpiles. The British Army had never known this kind of unit. Unlike the Commandos, they looked more like native Bedouins than soldiers. The Willys Jeep of the Western Desert is an enduring symbol of the tenacity of the SAS and its focus on ingenuity. Few of these vehicles survived the war. Peter Sanders has become an expert in the vehicle and has painstakingly restored this remarkable symbol of Britain's wartime prowess.
The SAS were operating in the North African desert, 1941, and they were initially operating with the Long Range Desert Group, who were using Chevrolet trucks, Ford trucks, and eventually the SAS decided they wanted their own mobility, so they went for the Willys Jeep, and they had a few of these issued to them early on in the campaign, 1942. It would have been used in usually small numbers of vehicles, 3 or 4 vehicles, targeting against enemy airfields, trying to blow up enemy aircraft on landing strips. So they would have attacked at night, they would have attacked with surprise and then disappeared back into the desert again. It's been highly modified by the SAS from its usual configuration, with the armament and the extra features that it had. It's light, it's fairly fast, very rugged, easy to maintain, ideal really for use in the desert. Typically we had 50 caliber Browning on one of the vehicles in the patrol. More usually there would be the Vickers K, drum-fed weapon, high rate of fire, which came from old Gloucester Gladiator biplanes that were available in the desert at the time. Those are Vickers K again, very favoured armament by the SAS, even through into the Normandy campaign. These weapons were used. Again, very reliable, rugged, easy to maintain, and a very potent weapon. A vehicle like this is not designed for long desert patrols, so fuel was a very important element in the SAS. So these jerry cans would be as much as the vehicle could carry, loaded with petrol, a little bit of water, but mainly petrol to keep the vehicle going. 90 days was a typical type of patrol. Other patrols were shorter for a very specific target. I think every vehicle was very different. Looking at the old photographs, it seemed to be depending on the crew as to how they wanted to configure the vehicle. At certain times in the campaign they were very effective. They were really a thorn in the side of Rommel, as many people have said, blowing up his aircraft, his petrol dumps, some of his lines of communication. I think they were, for the size of the unit, very effective. It's fairly highly sprung, so it's quite bumpy. The Jeep is well known for giving spinal injuries to its passengers. It's not very well padded on the seats, so it's quite uncomfortable to drive around for any length of time in. The SAS vehicles of today are based on a similar configuration, based on Land Rovers or other all-terrain vehicles, but with the same idea of high firepower and long range. The Willis Jeep was really the first in its field in this kind of all-terrain vehicle, and it was the only one available for the British at the time. The water for the engine was the main problem. In the high temperatures of the desert, the engine would typically boil over, so they fitted the unit with a condenser which allowed the radiator to overpressure. The water condensed in the can and was sucked back into the engine, so over the length of a patrol they very rarely needed to top up the radiator. Deserts can be rocky, they can be flat, they can have the typical sand dunes, and your campaigns had to cope with all of those types of terrain. Some of the targets were in Benghazi harbour, for instance, where shipping was targeted. The airfields tended to be along the coastline, so the patrols tended to come in from the desert, strike at coastal targets, and then disappear back into the desert again. Most of the navigation was done by the sun compass, which allows you to get your bearing from the angle of the sun, and the sun compass is usually mounted on the front of the vehicle and allows you to navigate really very accurately in the absence of other navigation aids. They tended not to carry radios. Sometimes later on in the campaign there were radio trucks associated with the patrols, but most of the time the patrol was out of contact of its base. The SAS developed very much as an irregular unit, initially with whatever equipment the unit could get hold of, and that included German, British or American, as was available.
The SAS soldiers who drove vehicles like this were responsible for the death of countless Germans and kept the Afrika Korps off balance. But they alone could not turn the tide of the larger campaign. They pursued the Germans without mercy. They knew if caught, they would be shot. Still, their stealth and cunning tied up German troops by the hundreds. No one knew when they would next strike. Rommel himself paid the SAS the greatest compliment when he wrote in his diary that they caused us more damage than any other British unit of equal strength. The havoc wrought by the SAS helped Montgomery seize the initiative, and the tide of battle slowly turned. On October the 23rd, the 8th Army finally struck back. The Battle of El Alamein lasted more than a week. The Germans were driven back and ultimately withdrew from North Africa. Impressive as the Allied victories were in Africa, Germany's fate was being sealed far to the north. When the German army invaded the Soviet Union on June the 22nd, 1941, they attacked along a 1,500-mile front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The intensity of the fighting was far worse than had been experienced on the Western Front. Stalin pleaded with Churchill and Roosevelt to initiate a second front to relieve his beleaguered troops. There was little the Allies could do. Any amphibious assault directly against Hitler's seemingly impregnable Atlantic Wall would require massive amounts of troops and equipment. There were less than 500 men in the SAS and only a few thousand in the commandos. This was not enough to mount a full-scale offensive, but some action was urgently needed. The British Combined Operations Command, responsible for planning the invasion of Europe, proposed a large raid on the French port of Dieppe. This would give the British an opportunity to test the Germans, as well as a chance to test the command and control infrastructure the Allies were building in Britain. In the pre-dawn hours of August the 18th, 1942, 5,000 Canadian soldiers, 1,100 British commandos, and a handful of Americans attacked. It was a near disaster. The Germans were well entrenched. The British and Canadians made it to the beaches but suffered huge casualties. More than half of the landing force were killed or wounded. The men who sacrificed their lives at Dieppe undoubtedly saved thousands of others 2 years later during the Normandy invasion. The experience was a bitter one, but the raid served notice to the Germans that they would soon face a two-front war. Pressing the battle against the Germans, the Allies sent guerrilla teams into the Balkans, where they linked up with partisans and tied up nearly 500,000 German troops. These assignments demanded great diplomatic skills, along with bravery and stealth. In Yugoslavia, a near-civil war was fought between the communists and nationalist groups when they weren't fighting the Germans. It was in this cauldron of hatred that the SAS, commandos and other specialized teams sought to instill discipline and focused the attack on the Nazi occupation forces. By 1943, the war grew more intense on the Western Front, with invasions of Sicily and Italy. Rugged terrain combined with fierce German resistance slowed and threatened to stop the Allied advance. The commandos and SAS crossed German lines and struck from behind. Their degree of success can be measured by Hitler's response. He ordered that captured commandos be shot, and SAS men who were taken prisoner turned over to the Gestapo and ruthlessly exterminated. The threat did not stop the raids. Still, the war could not be won by simply harassing the Germans on the frontiers of the Third Reich. Germany would have to be attacked directly, and the road to Berlin began at the Atlantic Wall along the beaches of France. The invasion would require every man and weapon the British and Americans could muster. The SAS and the commandos were among the 170,000 men of the assault force that landed along the 50-mile front in Normandy. SAS units again were deployed behind the Germans' lines. As the Allied armies fanned out across France, SAS units attacked the Germans wherever they could. The aim was to cause as much havoc as possible. They succeeded and spearheaded the Allies' triumphant drive into Paris. At the height of the fighting, the SAS never numbered more than a couple of thousand men. yet they had killed or seriously wounded almost 8,000 enemy troops and captured nearly 23,000. In all, the SAS suffered some 300 casualties. The victory in Europe was a bitter one for the SAS. During the fighting, these seemingly undisciplined troops, with their unorthodox techniques, had been barely tolerated by the more traditional Army High Command. No role was seen for them, and in October 1945, the SAS was disbanded. The commandos were integrated into the Royal Marines. The British experiment in special forces appeared to have come to an end, but the post-war period was a chaotic time. Calls for independence were spreading through the tattered remains of the British Empire. Southeast Asia became a focal point. British forces were first tested in Malaya. In 1948, nearly 10,000 guerrillas took to the jungle in their fight against British rule. At first, the British responded with conventional forces, only to be caught up in a bitter and inconclusive struggle over unfamiliar jungle terrain, against an enemy they could rarely see. New tactics for counterinsurgency, such as the deployment of four-man teams by parachute and their recovery by helicopter, became standard practice. Another important technique was the concept of the fortified village. Not only could the local inhabitants be protected from attack, but the SAS would work to improve living conditions. Winning the hearts and minds of the people worked well. It was a strategy the SAS put to use throughout other regional conflicts. One of the regiment's most severe tests came in the British colony of Aden at the foot of the Saudi peninsula. Fighting broke out in 1964 when the British government announced it would leave within 4 years. Turbulent internal politics between Arab tribes, mixed with the mounting tensions of the Cold War, made for an explosive situation. This was no simple war. At stake was who would ultimately control the all-important access to the Red Sea and Suez Canal. The SAS was forced to return to the Middle East. They fought in the desert and in the mountains, and in the crowded bazaars, a form of urban warfare that was particularly frustrating for the British, as 1 or 2 snipers were able to pin down large numbers of soldiers for long periods of time. This war of attrition dragged on until the scheduled date for independence arrived, and the SAS withdrew as planned. Since the demise of the British Empire, the SAS has served the British government in a wide range of campaigns, from Northern Ireland to the Falklands. But it was on the streets of London that these uniquely skilled men captured the world's attention in the spring of 1980. 5 terrorists seeking independence for their homeland from Iran seized the Iranian embassy in London and took 26 hostages. A unit from B Squadron 22 SAS arrived on the scene within hours. Attempts were made to negotiate a peaceful end to the siege. At the same time, the SAS were preparing their plan to free the hostages. At a nearby barracks, they built a small-scale model of the embassy, then a full-scale replica. The SAS succeeded in planting a number of sensitive listening devices and installing cameras with lenses no bigger than pinheads through the embassy walls. The hostages were held in different areas of the embassy, and the SAS studied ways to strike simultaneously from several directions. Speed would be critical in order to save the lives of the hostages if shooting broke out. The standoff and negotiations dragged on throughout the week, but on May the 5th, 5 days after the embassy was seized, the patience of the terrorists ran out. They began killing the hostages, starting with the press attaché. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher ordered the SAS to act. Government negotiators kept the terrorists distracted on the telephone, giving the SAS a last few precious moments to get into position.
And if you want to do any stupid thing, all the hostages will be killed at once.
Now, whereabouts shall we put that coach first? Shall we put it
opposite of the door?
Well, opposite of the door is a very vague phrase. If you're looking out of the window...
After we check it,
yes,
then you will put it beside the door.
Well, let's talk about that then.
Okay.
Opposite the front door, you're looking straight out over the park.
And after we check it, you will?
Yes, can you listen to me and we'll just talk about the first movement of the coach up to the front door. Now, if you look out of the window directly ahead of you, there is the park. Now, to the right, there is just the end of the wall, and that is where those gas men were working on the generators and were working on that gas leak.
Okay, I'll phone you after 3 minutes.
No, let's talk about this,
Yeah,
Salim.
they're asking me. Just 3 minutes, I'll go. I'll come again.
Hello, Salim. Salim.
We are listening to some suspicion movement.
There is no suspicious movement,
There's
Salim.
suspicion. Okay.
Salim.
Just a minute, I'll come back again. I'm going to check.
Salim,
Sorry.
there is no suspicious movement, Sim. Salim. Salim, there is no suspicious movement.
The terrorists quickly recognized the hopelessness of their situation. Some tried to hide among the hostages, others offered to surrender, but it was too late. 4 out of the 5 terrorists were killed. The entire operation took just 11 minutes to execute. In sharp contrast to the spectacular performance at Prince's Gate is the protracted war being waged against the Irish Republican Army. The first 12 SAS men were deployed in Northern Ireland in January 1976. The regiment has maintained a presence there ever since. In sharp contrast to the spectacular performance at Prince's Gate is the protracted war being waged against the Irish Republican Army. The first 12 SAS men were deployed in Northern Ireland in January 1976. The regiment has maintained a presence there ever since. Although their numbers have been few, generally around 20 men at any one time, the SAS has been responsible for the death of some 30 members of the IRA, mainly through ambushes. The SAS has evolved from a rugged handful of men into a highly skilled professional organisation capable of clandestine warfare at any level. The famed SAS kit does not exist in any strict sense. The equipment used by the men varies from mission to mission. Because of the need for flexibility, the men of the Special Forces are experts with a wide range of weapons. The Heckler & Koch MP5 submachine gun is a favourite. It is versatile, accurate and fast-firing. Although the standard firing procedure is called the double tap. Shoot 2 rounds, assess your target, and fire again. Favoured handguns include the Browning 9mm automatic or the .357 Magnum. All members of the British Armed Forces are trained on the standard Army issue SA-80 assault rifle. The SA-80 is not considered rugged enough for many of the long-lasting Special Forces missions. The American M16 rifle is sometimes carried by the Special Forces and is valued for its accuracy and range in spite of being a relatively lightweight weapon. This American connection goes beyond hardware. Members of the Special Forces often cross-train with their US counterparts. There are numerous American Special Forces: the Army Green Berets, the Navy SEALs, the Air Force Special Ops Units, and the US Marine Corps Reconnaissance Battalion and the Delta Force, particularly trained in hostage rescue. all of these units have a common bond with their British cousins. Their training is very hard. The need for these units to work together is important because of the increasing international nature of military interventions. There was no better example of this than the Gulf War. In 1990, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait sent shockwaves throughout the world. The Allies were stunned, and it was months before the Americans, British, French, and dozens of other nations were ready to push Saddam Hussein back. The Allied coalition had built the largest concentration of conventional arms since World War II. Yet when Iraqi Scuds began raining down on Israel and Saudi Arabia, horror swept the Western camps. Patriot missile batteries served to boost Allied morale, but were only partially effective against the onslaught of the Scud missiles. If Israel, with her secret nuclear weapons, reacted to the attacks by starting her own war with Iraq, biblical admonitions about Armageddon would be frightfully close to becoming reality. There were urgent consultations in Washington and London. Allied air forces with their precision bombs and cruise missiles surprised and impressed the world with their accuracy. But targets had to be identified, and the Iraqis, in spite of many other misjudgments, learned to hide their mobile missile launches from the prying eyes of reconnaissance satellites. The Scud missiles would have to be destroyed by men on foot. The SAS were seemingly born for the job. The desert was their ancestral home. But unlike the ragged early days of the Western Desert, the men assigned to the Gulf War were well-trained, well-equipped, and ready to go. SAS Sergeant Andy McNabb led an 8-man patrol, codenamed Bravo 20, to destroy the Scuds inside Iraq. McNabb describes how the operation began.
But it was the one evening. We normally work in 4-man patrols. Myself, Vince, another patrol commander, was called forward to the officer commanding B Squadron, and said we have a task, and he gave what we call a warning order, which gives you what the task is going to be in rough sort of parameters of the task, and no move before, so that give you time to prepare. It was 2 4-man patrols put together because we were going to be so isolated and on foot, so it gave us more protection, if you like, having an 8-man fighting patrol rather than a 4-man patrol. So we started to prepare for our task, which was firstly to cut the communications link between Baghdad and the Scud teams in northwest Iraq. So if we could cut the communications, that means the Scuds wouldn't know where or when to fire. So we wouldn't have to actually attack the Scuds, because what you want is the maximum damage with a minimum amount of effort. So our first task was to find a landline which run along the northern MSR, the main supply route from Baghdad to Jordan, basically. Now, if we can cut that communications link, that'd be fine. Our second task was to attack the Scud when we found them. Now, we'd do that in 3 different ways. We would call in an air attack. If we couldn't do that, we would then do a standoff attack with 66 anti-tank rockets. If we couldn't do that, we'd have to do a hands-on attack, which would mean prime target assassination of the surveyors and the operators, and the demolition of the transport erector launcher rather than the missile, because there was a possibility that they have binary chemicals, which we didn't want to get involved in. So that was our task, to cut the communications line and to actually stop Scud firing, attack the Scud. We entered into Iraq and followed the planned route. We were illuminated by what we probably think was a Roland, which was quite scary. Again, the helicopter crew had to earn their money at that stage. Because remember, we're going at sort of 80 knots an hour at 70 feet above the ground in the Chinook. So they had to actually have to rise up so they can actually manoeuvre, which is quite scary. So we were quite glad when we landed. The drills that were employed is actually to get down. 4 men just went out to get out of the dust and to actually observe the air and cover the arcs of fire. And the other 4 would just unload the equipment. Because we were going as a 8-man foot patrol, each man was carrying about 15 stones of equipment because that was the equipment's task. We landed, the helicopter lifted off and exfiltrated out. We then saw our first Scud launch, which was to the west, about 10 kilometres away. We couldn't do anything about that at that stage. There's nothing we could do. We'd have to get to our cache area, which was going to be our operating base. That was about 20 kilometres away. We made it the first night and made our cache area, which became our lie-up point for that area, for that night. The next day we tried to send our situation report, our sitrep out. In fact, we weren't getting no communications at all. All day we tried, everybody's signals trained, but we didn't have no luck. But in our planning and preparation, we've catered for that eventuality anyway. There's no problems. The next day we had the same problem. Still no communications. However, we were still in our lost comms time frame, so there was no big problems. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, we heard goats. Again, this was no problems to us because we were in good cover and no tracks led to our lie-up point, or LUP. Unfortunately, we had twin S-60 anti-aircraft guns a couple of 100 metres away to our northwest. They didn't know we were there, and we were concealed. We was quite confident. It was then the goat herder, a young lad, 5 or 6, came with his goats, and we had eye-to-eye contact and sort of eyes big as saucers, and he knew what was going on and went screaming off to the guns. So we were compromised. We had to take that as a compromise. We started to prepare ourselves to actually move out, and that's just drinking as much fluid as we can, because we know it's going to be sort of, if we're not get involved in a contact, we're going to have to start making some distance. It was daylight, so we'd have to sort of move quite quickly. So we would start sort of rehydrating, just getting some chocolates down our neck, and then refilling our water bottles, just making ready to go. We then heard a tracked vehicle, so we had to abandon what we was doing, and we stood to with the 66s. And the vehicle, in fact, turned out to be a bulldozer, which was trying to get up onto the main supply route. That actually left, and shortly after, we actually patrolled out. We left a lot of the equipment there, and we just carried our belt kit, which never comes off of us. It stays on us all the time. Our weapons and our Bergens, which are our rucksacks. We patrolled out. About 400 or 500 metres after our patrol started, we had our first contact from the east, and this consisted of 2 armoured personnel carriers with turret-mounted 7.62 short machine guns and some infantry in a soft-skin vehicle. The contact was initiated by us purely because it's going to happen. There is nothing you can do, so just get on with it and get it over and done with. We had to drop the Bergens. One of our SOPs, our standard operating procedures, is that you can't actually fight in a contact with the Bergen on because it's far too heavy. So we dumped the Bergens, keep the belt kit on, which is basically our bullets and water, and initiate the contact, and went forward. The only way to go was go forward. It's flat, northwest Iraq, it's just a flat plain. So we'd have to initiate the contact and go for it. This contact lasted for about 40 minutes, and during that time we actually got back to our Bergens, put them on, and started running away quickly. Unfortunately, as we was moving out of the way, we were engaged by the S-60s, who could now bear their guns down on us because we were heading west. They joined in the firefight, and in fact it was the coming up to last light, and it was the darkness that actually sort of got us away, which was quite good. It was then I made the decision that we've got to escape and evade. Syria was 178 kilometres as the crow flies on the line, so we'd have to go there. That was our nearest sort of safe haven. We weren't too sure if the communications, what we'd been trying to sort of get through our compromise, have got through, and if they did, would they actually get shot down? There was far more enemy in the area than we were told to expect. In fact, there was in excess of 3,000 troops in the area, and this is what the guns were protecting, obviously the armour and the troops. So if the aircraft did come in, would it actually get shot down? So I decided then we'll go to Syria. We had to put a deception plan in and travel the first 25 kilometres south, hoping that all follow-ups are going to be south. They'll naturally think that the escape route, the E&E plan, would be south towards Saudi. During this time, we had lost our Bergens during the withdrawal because we couldn't actually get out of the fire of the anti-aircraft guns quick enough. And we dropped our Bergens, and the signals operator had left the radio in the Bergen, which is no problems because we had 4 TACBs, which is the distress beacons. Now these work on the international distress frequencies, and we were told that AWACS had 24-hour coverage of us. So you pull the pin and you speak to AWACS, and within 15 seconds there's normally this very calm, mostly female voice will come up and try and calm you down, and you're hollering and shouting, trying to sort of get fire down, and they'll just be talking very nice and calmly to calm you down. It doesn't work, but that's the theory. But nothing was happening, so we carried on trying with our TACBs to raise AWACS. Since then we found we was 300 kilometres out of range of AWACS. They were 300 kilometres further south.
While Scud missiles continued to cause havoc in Saudi Arabia and Israel, McNab faced increasing difficulties on the march to Syria. One man was injured in the firefight, and another began suffering from hypothermia in the bitter cold. In the confusion, the men had become separated. 3 men in one group, McNab and 4 others in another. They lost contact with each other. Still, McNab was confident. SAS training had prepared the men to survive alone if necessary. In one hopeful moment, McNab was able to relay his Bravo 20 call sign to a passing American aircraft. It was the patrol's first and only contact with friendly forces. But the temperature dropped, causing problems for the entire war effort. Another man was stricken with hypothermia. Hiding from passing Iraqi patrols, precious hours were lost reviving the stricken trooper while hiding. Once more, they were discovered by the Iraqis. McNab was running out of options.
We got out of that situation and sat down and have what we call Chinese Parliament. Just look at what's going on, look at all the factors that are affecting us, and come to a sort of a general sort of conclusion what we're going to do. And then it's down to the patrol commander to actually make that decision what is happening from the different sort of points of view. And because of the weather, if the weather didn't kill us, because we're all at different stages of hypothermia, if the weather didn't kill us, the enemy would. Far more enemy than we expected, far more. So I decided that we'll hijack a vehicle. And a couple of kilometres to the north, there was what we call a metal road, which is a basic tarmac road. We call it metal road. We put an OP on that road just to see what vehicles are going up and down. And they were what you would expect in a desert terrain. They were off-road vehicles, you know, Mazda pickups, Toyota Land Cruisers, 4-ton trucks. At last night, myself and Bob, another patrol member, would go up, leave our weapons and our belt equipment down with the other 3 members of the patrol, and wave down a vehicle, him pretending to be injured. The lights come from the west. We got onto the road at last light, waved the vehicle down, and as the lights stopped blinding us, instead of a Mazda pickup truck, it was a yellow taxi from New York, 1950s taxi. It was chrome. There was sort of white wall tires. You know, it was out sort of some strange comedy. We lifted the vehicle. Unfortunately, we were actually stuck on the road, so there's no way we can go cross terrain. Again, our mapping was very basic. We didn't have sort of high quality sort of maps. What we had was air charts, what pilots use, and everything from the roads to power lines is approximate alignment only. So it was the case of me driving and another patrol member called Steve Lane with a compass, basically with a compass. And when we got to a junction, if it was going west, that's the way we were going. And we just sort of going through the built-up areas, getting caught in a traffic jam. We got out of that. We got about 11 kilometres from the border with Syria, and we actually got drawn into a vehicle checkpoint, which was a static vehicle checkpoint, a permanent VCP. We had to initiate a contact to actually get out of that, and basically it was just a lot of firepower and all getting out and running away quickly. Under the confusion, we can actually get away. We had to cross the border that night because we're now in a built-up area near the Euphrates and near the border. So, you know, where there's water, there's irrigation, vegetation, habitation. So we had to do it that night, and it was just a matter of keep on heading west. We got involved in another contact, a small arms fire about platoon strength. We got out of that contact. We then started to head over some high ground, and we actually saw the border with Syria. And it was like a scene out of Close Encounters, because you had the distinct line of the border where there was darkness, and then the lit area of Syria. Unfortunately, we couldn't carry on west because we come up against some anti-aircraft guns, which then their infantry started firing. So the only way was to turn north and go through the major sort of built-up area. We got through that and actually got onto the banks of Euphrates, and we were exactly 10 kilometres from the border. At this time, it was just a matter of calming down, refilling the water bottles, assessing what's going on. There was chaos at this time. People were firing all over the place, probably firing at each other. There were some aircraft going overhead, so the guns, the anti-aircraft guns were firing. Everybody, total confusion, which we used to actually get away. We then started to slow ourselves down and actually patrol slowly, heading west. We then got caught up in a like a brigade rear echelon area. There was a sort of a command structure there. There was lots of radio antennas, lots of sort of static sentries and vehicles moving around. This actually started a series of contacts that went on from sort of 11 o'clock that night until the early hours. And at one stage, the patrol got split into three. There was myself and a New Zealander, a Kiwi called Mark, and there was a fellow called Dinger and Steve Lane. There was two distinct groups. The fifth member actually was shot at some stage that night. He got a 7.62 short in the head. Travelled down, come out of his stomach and hit a white phos. So at least he died quickly. So we were split into two. There was no way we could actually get ourselves together. It was total chaos. They were firing at us, we're firing at them. They were firing at each other. Lots of shouting, lots of light, lots of confusion.
Senior Allied officers still didn't know the fate of Bravo 20. McNabb came within 2.5 miles of the Syrian border and freedom, but like his remaining team, he was captured and taken to Baghdad. While the city was being pounded by Allied planes, they were tortured. The men stuck to their cover story that they were part of a search and rescue mission. They would rather die before revealing they were members of the SAS.
We went through interrogations where we were stripped of our clothing, continuously blindfolded and handcuffed. We were beaten with planks of wood. We got flogged. I had a spoon that was heated over a paraffin heater, rubbed onto an open wound on my leg. I had some teeth damage at my back molars on the left-hand side. And at one stage during the interrogation, they said they've got a dentist who was a dentist who had practiced in London for 9 years, and he'll come and sort my teeth out. And in fact, this dentist came in and pulled them out with pliers. So there was a continuous interrogation routine. They would go and get one of us, finish with us, and then go and get the next. When we were in the cells, there was a routine of people being beaten by the guards. They would go into one cell, lots of shouting, lots of hollering, lots of just general sort of abuse. Tell you to stand. In fact, you couldn't stand at this stage because obviously physically you couldn't move. As you make an attempt to move, they then start hitting you and kicking you and hitting you with this rubber hose. They'd then go on to the next one, which was quite scary because you could actually hear this going on, and you knew your turn was next. This went on for 6 days. I was then taken in for an interrogation, and they said they knew I was the commander and that they had people in hospital who was getting and still needed medical attention. If they didn't tell them what they wanted to know, they'll simply let them die, and they'll let the other two die in the cells. I continued to sort of deny any information. This wasn't an act of bravado or sticking your chest out for Queen and country, because that really doesn't exist in the real world. What it was to actually have time to think. They given the threat, and you just can't actually sort of make a decision there and then. Number one, because you're physically incapable of doing it anyway, because you're going through this interrogation and torture. So what I needed was time to think. I again went through the interrogation, went through the beatings, was whipped again, and taken into the cell. By now, is myself, we didn't know it at the time, but myself and Stan had hepatitis at this stage. we was basically living in our own sort of excrement, which obviously made us dehydrate more because we had no clothes on. We were just exposed to the elements. Once I got back to the cell, the beating stopped for me, and the other two were getting beaten in rotation. So what I decided to do is break into another cover story, and hopefully take the chance that they'll believe it, and hopefully keep it. You know, I had to take their threat for real. I had to take the threat that they would let people die for real. I eventually got taken in for another interrogation, and I told them that we were members of what we call COP platoon, which is a close observation platoon. Now, every infantry battalion in the British Army has got a close observation platoon. What helped us was that a lot of their officers, or not some of their officers, had received military training at Staff College in Camberley, just outside of London, and they've gone through the British military system. So what I was saying actually sort of equated to somebody who was listening there, and we got away with it. We actually got away with it. The other two were taken in to confirm the story, and obviously switched on what was going on, and we actually got away with it.
Learning to endure interrogation is part of SAS training. It includes a nightmarish simulation of capture. The subject does not know when it will happen. When it comes, it's necessarily brutal. The subject is hooded and dragged into a holding area. The ordeal will last 12 hours, perhaps more. She is forced to assume a position assured to cause maximum discomfort. White noise is played. It's designed to numb the mind, and it does. No rest from the strain is allowed. The subject's arms now ache from fatigue.
No rest from the strain is allowed. The subject's arms now ache from fatigue.
She is brought before an interrogator for the first of repetitive grilling sessions. Only last name, rank, serial number and date of birth are permitted to be revealed. While the subjects begin the interrogation knowing it's part of training, after the hours pass the mind begins having difficulty focusing on where reality begins and ends. This interrogation drill has become a test of true survival.
What's your number?
W1355782.
W1350782. Where do you come from? Where were you born? What are you doing here? There's two ways of doing this. You can either talk to me, or it's going to get rougher. Okay? What's your name?
Ford.
Spell Ford. Spell Ford. What's your unit?
Can I answer the question?
Do you want a bit more pain, do you? Okay? Take her out. Take her out!
The tortured wars in the Balkans since the breakup of Yugoslavia have horrified the world. The degree of involvement of the British Special Forces in these conflicts cannot ever be accurately assessed. The long, painful Bosnian War took place under the eyes of the United Nations, with Western forces often under strict orders not to intervene beyond assisting in the UN's humanitarian mission. Except for the occasional aerial bombardment, it was not until the very end of the Bosnian conflict that ground artillery forces and heavy airstrikes were authorized. Here the SAS could have played a vital role in locating ground targets. The Kosovo Air War was conducted largely by high-flying bombers and the occasional cruise missile. Computers played a vital role in this phase of the war, with few, if any, spotters on the ground beyond the rebel Kosovo army. The results of misplaced bombs inevitably resulted in civilian casualties. Once the war was over, both in Bosnia and Kosovo, the particular talents of the Special Forces could be utilised in the hunt for suspected war criminals. Capturing these sometimes heavily guarded fugitives has been a mission virtually designed for the talents of the SAS. They require stealth, ability and willingness to use deadly force in very restricted conditions. Also important is knowing when to back off, when the snatch plan cannot be carried out with maximum result. Virtually no British military armed intervention is accomplished without some involvement of the Special Forces. They may be involved in planning, reconnaissance or rescue contingencies. The operations in East Timor and Sierra Leone are typical of new challenges facing the British Army. They are, by their very nature, limited operations, yet can be deadly to those involved. If we accept the idea that armed force is sometimes necessary, either for our own protection or as a method of suppressing violence against our friends and allies, Britain could not wish for a more dependable and capable force than the SAS. As General Sir John Hackett put it, the success of armies depends to a very high degree on the coherence of the group, and the coherence of the group depends on the degree of trust and confidence of its members in each other. The Special Air Service has maintained that tradition of confidence, even as it faces the uncertainty and dangers of the 21st century.